Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I first just wanted to start by saying thank you for the book. I read Smoke Signals about 2 or 3 years ago, and it really just reinvigorated my interest in cannabis and connected a lot of dots for me. So thank you for that.
Very welcome.
And I just wanted to know a little bit. I know that you've got a history or a backstory that involves a lot of advocacy and kind of blowing the lid on a lot of corruption. So I wanted to know more about how you moved from that kind of advocacy into the cannabis space, the backstory.
Well, yeah, it's correct. Actually, my background is as a journalist, in particular as an investigative journalist. And I was focusing on themes important for promoting social justice and so forth. And it's not a big leap from that into the medical cannabis world. I was living in California, which had legalized cannabis for therapeutic use under a doctor's supervision, going back to 1996, which is the year I moved to California, although I had lived here before as well. So when that measure was passed, I didn't think all that much of it at the time. I voted for it, like a majority of Californians. It seemed like a sensible thing to do. But 10 years after the vote, still, there was a lot of pressure on the medical cannabis community. There were people who are obviously very sick, whom law enforcement was treating very roughly, abusively, raids and all kinds of pressure, arrests and so forth. And the question that I posed to myself really was, well, why is this sort of thing happening if California legalized medical cannabis? Why is there still this interference from law enforcement? And people have an image of California, particularly abroad, as this sort of the golden land of cannabis. And California is topographically and population-wise a very diverse state. And while parts of it are very, you might say, liberal with respect to cannabis, San Francisco Bay Area, the big cities on the coast, had a very progressive attitude toward cannabis legalization, particularly for medical use and later from legalization in general. Much of California doesn't share that perspective. And in the more rural counties, the less populated counties, law enforcement tended to be very rough with people who are maybe growing a few plants to treat themselves or whatever. So the question was, why is this still happening? Why is they're almost like fascistic type of raids? And I don't use that phrase lightly. Really like a police state kind of treatment of people who are obviously very sick. And beginning to write about medical cannabis, particularly from the law enforcement perspective, it naturally led to the question of, well, what's going on with medical cannabis? People say that it's helpful, and I didn't doubt it, but is there really a scientific basis for medical cannabis? Is there a theoretical basis for understanding how it works, if it works, so forth and so on? And that led me as a journalist into writing about the science behind medical cannabis, which is quite an amazing subject, and that I knew very little about initially when I started writing about cannabis, as a social phenomenon. And that opened up a whole world to start to understand the science and interact with scientists from all around the world, including from Australia, incidentally, but who are really doing cutting edge research into the sort of the biological substrate of us as humans that is the reason why cannabis actually is effective in any way, or actually confers changes in our physiology and our psychology and how we feel if it's a THC rich plant, in terms of if we feel high or whatever. But and that's a fascinating subject that I knew very little about, and it really underscored the validity to, that there really was something going on here. It wasn't just a bunch of people in California using medical excuses to get high. That it really went beyond that, and it helped me understand, what's going on here. Even though oftentimes there's holes in the research, there's still missing parts because prohibition, the laws against cannabis have impeded medical research. But despite that, there is still a lot of data now, both from patients and from what we know about what, compounds like THC and CBD do to mice and the animal studies, and increasingly now a little more clinical research as well. And then there's also a tremendous sweep of historical data, going back literally thousands of years, where different cultures were using cannabis as part of their pharmacopoeia, their herbal, as herbal medicine. And when you put it all together, it's a very formidable and convincing body of evidence that validates what people are claiming that cannabis does for them therapeutically.
And is this why? Is this the idea behind Project CBD? At what point did that come about?
Yeah, I mean, that it grew out of the same set of research that what I wrote for the same activities exploring this world that ended up in the book Smoke Signals, which you referred to, but also went into the founding of Project CBD. What happened was this: essentially, as a journalist, I started covering science conferences, very reputable organizations like the International Cannabinoid Research Society, where scientists from all over the world, several hundred, would gather each year to talk about different aspects of what was being discovered, not just about the plant and the compounds, but about human physiology and how what the research into the plant was revealing about how the brain worked and so forth and so on. And that at these events I was hearing, but at these conferences, and incidentally, there were very few journalists there. It was really mainly scientists, including Nobel laureates. This is a very serious group of people. What I learned at these conferences about CBD in particular, a component of marijuana, if you will, of cannabis, that I didn't really know much about, but it was getting all the raves at these conferences in terms of what was being shown in terms of preclinical research and the therapeutic potential that this compound in particular had. And we're talking about cannabidiol, which is a non-intoxicating component of the cannabis plant, and it's very much a kind of like you could think of it with THC as sort of a brother-sister act, or as a husband and wife team, a power couple. They're both very important components of the plant, but up until that time, the medical cannabis community was really oriented toward THC. That's all that people had access to, plants that we would refer to as THC-rich. And these plants would get you high, get you intoxicated. They'd also make you feel a lot better, alleviate nausea, pain, and it could do a lot of good in terms of one's health. That's what people were learning in California. But really, that's what it was about, that experience more than anything. And that went along with getting high. I don't think there's anything wrong with that intrinsically, but that was what the medical marijuana phenomenon initially was in California. So we learned about this small group of people I was interacting with, other journalists. We heard about CBD at these science conferences, and then we would lament among ourselves, it's sort of a pity that this is not available for patients in California, because it seems to have so much potential. And then lo and behold, in 2009, 2010, we sort of serendipitously discovered a few different cannabis varietals or chemovars or strains, as they might be called, varieties of the plant that had significant amounts of CBD in it, and not just the THC. And that was made possible because analytical labs started emerging to service the medical cannabis industry, or the putative industry. It was still very much, it wasn't a green rush yet, let's put it that way. But different organizations, businesses, were popping up to service the industry, including a few labs that would analyze the contents of the marijuana strains that were available in dispensaries that medical patients could buy. And really what it was all about, quite frankly, in the beginning, was assigning a number to the amount of THC in the plant. And the presumption, incorrectly, I should add, was that the higher the number of THC in terms of the amount in the strain, that means it was better a better product, a better remedy, and so forth. That's an oversimplification. It's certainly not necessarily the case, but that's what people were looking for in terms of marketing and so forth. You know, if you put a big number on it, people are more likely to buy it and so forth. Well, you know, 1 out of every 1,000 strains that would come in to be tested by these labs, you know, would pop up an interesting mark on the chromatogram that would show, you know, where there would be spikes if there's certain chemicals in the bud of the marijuana plant. And lo and behold, once in a while, like I say, 1 of every 1,000 maybe, they'd have a little bump for CBD. So we knew that, oh, this had some CBD in the plant, and it wasn't just all these high THC varietals. And when we learned of this, we would contact the growers of the plant and tell them that we thought they had something significant. And it's interesting because early on, and maybe after half a year, maybe 6 different strains we identified in Northern California and contacted the growers and so forth. And the growers had oftentimes similar but very interesting comments. They were concerned that they may not be able to sell their crop to a dispenser because it wasn't, you know, didn't have the same kind of high that would really get you there, you know, that people enjoy when they smoke marijuana. It's not that it wouldn't necessarily get you high, but it wasn't quite the same. So they were concerned that they wouldn't be able to sell it, but they would make a comment. But, you know, I have to say, it sure helped my back pain more than any other strain I have ever tried, you know. And we were hearing that it was good for pain, good for anxiety. It's what people started reporting. And so what we were able to do is get samples of these plants and clone them out. I mean, make cuttings and sell we wouldn't sell it, but they would be sold in stores. We would actually just give it away. We gave it to patients, a few times to doctors, dispensaries, anybody that wanted it. We would give it away initially because the whole idea was to get it into the medical marijuana world in California to see what it did. Would it be anything like, would it help, would it affect people in any way like it was affecting the mice? And if it did, we knew this is going to be a really big deal, because not only would that indicate, you know, very interesting therapeutic possibilities, but because CBD is not intoxicating, it really opens up a whole dimension, or many dimensions of possibility, because because it meant that people who weren't comfortable with getting high, who didn't want to get high or afraid of getting high, didn't want to have anything to do with marijuana, once they heard, well, actually, you can take it, you don't even have to smoke it. You can take it in other ways, and it wouldn't get you high, but it had all these medical possibilities, medical benefits. That really was intriguing to people. So we felt right away that if this had a positive impact, it would open up the medical cannabis world to a whole new audience of support and so forth and so on. And it proved to be the case. But the other aspect of this, you know, we rediscovered the CBD at a time there was a lot of pressure still from law enforcement on the medical marijuana world in California, both from state, local, and federal law enforcement. This was early in the Obama presidency, and early on, he was not a great friend of cannabis. It might have been that he was sort of compensating for the fact that, as well known as a teenager or as a young adult, he was a smoker. So he might have been bending over backwards to show you he was tough on drugs or something like that. It improved later on. But early on, there was a lot of pressure. And we felt initially with CBD that this could really be a key to liberating cannabis from the drug abuse paradigm, because there could never be the charge that was being made at people using medical cannabis in California that was just an excuse to get high. A lot of them weren't really sick. They were gaming the system and so forth. And if CBD was a part of the mix, and if people were going to a dispensary to buy a product that either wouldn't get you high or would get you less high than otherwise, they really were buying it because they wanted a medical assistant, that it would be very difficult to levy that charge of it's just an excuse for stoners to get high. And we thought ultimately it would be a very difficult pill for the drug establishment, the drug war establishment to swallow. And I think it's proven to be the case, but it also has played out maybe differently than we anticipated. So really what CBD did, and this is now 10 years ago that we were involved with it initially, introducing it into the community, not just physically the plants, but also writing about it, talking about it. We had a website. We were trying to educate the community, doctors, patients, and otherwise, to the fact that medical cannabis, it's not just about THC. THC is very important. We don't diss it at all, but it's not the only game in town. It's not the complete, you can't get a complete understanding of what the potential is of the plant if you just focus on THC. That CBD was very important part of that. So that's how it started quite early. And then it spread from there. So our little group really was among a few people in Northern California who was quite interested in this. And different folks played their part, but in the end, it did catch on quite a bit, way more than we would imagine early on. Now it's become this huge global phenomenon, sort of a fad in a way. But I think there's also something enduring about it. It's not just a fad, because cannabis in general, CBD in particular, really do have a lot of medical attributes.
It's incredible. It feels like it must be a lot longer ago that happened, but it's crazy to think that short amount of time ago, farmers stumbled upon CBD. They weren't even breeding the plant for that particular cannabinoid. It just came out of you guys kind of.
Yeah, in some ways they were trying to avoid it, because again, what sold was the stuff that really made you feel high, And again, I have to emphasize, I have no problems with that. That can be very, very helpful for people in a lot of ways. We focused on CBD as Project CBD as an educational nonprofit, but we do so in a way to emphasize that it's to bring out the best of CBD, to really maximize its potential. You have to see it in the context of how it interacts with THC. The two of them together are really what, and not just the two of them, it's part of the whole plant matrix is really what it's all about. It's not just about one compound, which is sort of the emphasis always from the pharmaceutical establishment and from the government regulators. They're interested in one compound that has a specific result, and you can aim it at a specific receptor or in the brain or whatever. But cannabis is much more complex than that, and shouldn't be judged that way.
Right, I want to come back to some of this stuff just in a couple of questions. First, I just wanted to, in Australia, we've been watching the situation unfold in the United States. And on the one hand, I can acknowledge that it's very progressive and it's good to see things moving forward. And then on the other hand, we can see this contradiction that's playing out where it's been deemed at a state level as an essential item, but then it's still being federally banned and frowned upon. What's the legal situation? And I guess what I want to know is, in particular, what would you change? Like if, for our country, we're about to enter into this fight for legalization. I'd just love to know the key points that you would have changed in the way that the United States has gone about it.
Well, in the United States, we're still sort of betwixt and between. As you point out, federally, cannabis is still against the law. And there's a huge contradiction there. It's considered a controlled substance, but it's completely uncontrolled in the United States. I mean, there's so many people use it, whether it's in a state where it's legal or not, or it's just medically legal or not. So there's a patchwork of different laws among different states. And it's kind of a confusing mess in a way, but the overall momentum is toward opening things up, toward making cannabis available as a product, whether for recreational or adult use or therapeutic use. So it's there's a lot going on. There's a lot of money involved here. There's a lot of different approaches to it from a business perspective. It's a powerful territory to be engaged with, and in some ways it's a reflection of the society as a whole. That there's efforts to try to pharmaceuticalize the plant, again, take one component at a time, reduce it to that, do studies and, get it approved by the Federal Drug Administration, our FDA, which regulates medicines. And that's one approach, and that's typically how things work out. But again, it's not necessarily, that's a valid approach, but it's not the be all and end all. Unfortunately, it's privileged by the pharmaceutical approach. Is what's privileged legally, and it's So that's happening on one level. But on the other hand, we do have a lot of economic issues in the United States, particularly with COVID. It's almost as bad as the Great Depression for 100 years ago. So there are officials that wouldn't ordinarily be open-minded about cannabis are looking to it as a source of economic stimulus, legalize it, tax it. And that's a big factor what's pushing things along. So you have big corporations moving into this space. You can see in Canada, our neighbor to the north, alcohol companies, tobacco companies are moving in, investing hundreds of millions of dollars at a time. And frankly, I find that somewhat dismaying. But so it's difficult to know how it's going to play out. The fact of the matter is this is an important emerging area of the economy, and it's not yet regulated. And how it's going to be regulated is very, very important. And ultimately, cannabis is an agricultural crop, hemp as well. We have very backward laws with respect to hemp. We're catching up to Australia and the rest of the world with respect to hemp, thanks in part to CBD. But agriculture is a big contributor to global warming, to climate change, the way it's been practiced, big ag, corporate agriculture. So what's going to happen with cannabis? It's going to go in that direction, or maybe it could be the policy can be implemented in such a way it can advance efforts to deal with the climate crisis. Because hemp and cannabis are very important plants in terms of carbon sequestration and cleaning up the soil. It has lots of potential. It's not the only plant that does these sort of things, but certainly if it's looked upon that way, maybe there should be policies designed rather than just to tolerate it, to actually facilitate it, to subsidize farmers that are growing hemp and cannabis in ways that regenerate the soil, that sequester carbon. That's what I would like to see, but maybe I'm just sort of dreaming. But there is there's discussions taking place now, and governments have to pay heed now to what's happening with the climate. You can't pretend anymore that this is not real somehow. We experience in California these terrible fires. You also in Australia have had to deal with these shocking, almost apocalyptic events. This is what we're looking at. The question is, can cannabis be a medicine of a sort to help heal the earth and correct some of the imbalances that are the disequilibrium that's fostering these ecological events, the catastrophes? That's what I would like to see. But first and foremost for people, it's about, can it help people's health individually? And there's no doubt in my mind that cannabis is a very generous plant in that regard. It's not the only game in town. There's many other medicinal herbs, but the idea that it should be somehow kept away from the herbal pharmacopoeia, that it shouldn't be allowed back in, that's crazy. It's a remarkable plant. In ancient China, it was considered one of the supreme elixirs of immortality. And in many different cultures that embraced cannabis as a medicine, it was really held in high regard. And in a way that's interestingly consistent throughout history. In the first Chinese pharmacopoeia, the first pharmacopoeia ever assembled by human beings, they listed 100 different conditions that medicinal hemp, could help to treat. In 19th century America, the dispensatories, the accumulated data of what was good for what. They listed also cannabis tinctures for 100 different conditions. And now we know from our scientific understanding of the endocannabinoid system, as it's called, we have an understanding of why that's the case, why cannabis potentially could be helpful for so many different conditions, because it interacts, on a very deep biological level with how we function as human beings. In a very, very fundamental way. That's a whole discussion in of itself. And there are scientists, of course, in Australia, very well-versed in the endocannabinoid system and should be brought into the discussion in terms of legalization, because it really provided underpinning scientifically to understand why this is not something we should fear, why it's really an opportunity to take advantage of this knowledge. And it's not all, because we've had a prohibition, mainly led by the United States globally, we've lost the kind of connection and understanding with how best to use this plant for medicinal purposes. So we're all in the process of relearning that. And if I could make one suggestion as things start to roll out in Australia, and my limited understanding of what's happening in Australia is that it's somewhat federalized. It's happening in different regions or different states that have different ways of doing it. But what happened in California, I think, is really the best approach, because the law was written in such a way so it left it to the doctor and the patient to decide if medical cannabis is worth trying. And it didn't restrict the doctor or the patient's freedom by listing a set of conditions. Well, it can only be applied in these 10 conditions, So we have one state that says you can use it for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but the neighboring state says you can't. But they both are medical marijuana states. So it's kind of confusing in the US that way. But California, I think, is the best example, and some states have followed suit. Just make it between the doctor and the patient, because that will be the best way where people can explore and learn how to use these herbal medicines for optimal purposes, and when we can learn more about what it's good for and how to use it, because we're still in a great learning experiment now, and a lot has been learned thus far too. This has been happening now in California for 25 years or so, since 1996. You do the math. I think it's, what does that mean? 25, 35 years, whatever it is, it's been happening for a while now, and we've learned something, and it's worth. And so there's so much more to know. But what we do know ultimately is that cannabis is a very safe medicine, but it should be taken very seriously, particularly for people who are seriously ill and taking other medications, pharmaceuticals. Obvious questions we need to ask. Will cannabis, or will CBD in particular, interact with these other medications? What will that mean? Could that be harmful? Could it be helpful for that matter? And we're learning a lot about that as well. So it's great opportunities, I think, and it's the sooner the better that Australia opens up in this way, because there's a lot of people who really need this.
Yeah, beautiful. I guess we've got, like, medical cannabis is legal in Australia. I feel the problem is doctors by nature are very conservative. And still, like, I'm having conversations with my local doctor who is quite, I would say, alternative minded and progressive, but he's just not open to the science. I've sent him as much information as I possibly could, and he's just not open to it. And, my mum has like fibromyalgia, and I've tried to get her to try this medicine and speak to a doctor, but she's seen 3 different practitioners, and they've all not just said no, but strongly encouraged her away from it. So I feel adult use and recreational legalization has to happen, because we're not moving quick enough in the medical market. But I do agree it's good to have that doctor-patient relationship and build things that way. I really like what you said before. I read that you made the analogy between the feet tying of the Chinese women, and I wrote something down where you said, by privileging only type 3 cannabis with 0.3% THC or less, federal policy narrows the plant's genetic possibilities. So you've got the DEA on the one hand that's trying to re-regulate, I guess, the CBD laws, and then you've also got the pharmaceutical industry producing isolates, which, as you said, are avoiding the entourage effect or the full potential of the plant. And it's really just limiting the plant. And it wasn't until I heard that analogy that you made that I really kind of felt empathy for the plant. It's almost like we've got shackles on the plant.
The plant probably feels sorry for us, frankly. How crazy the culture has been around this plant. I mean, it's just a plant. It's an amazing plant, but come on, Yeah, it's interesting when you consider what the relationship overall would be to medical cannabis access or adult use recreational access. You would think that the latter would be good for the former, and that if there's less restrictions or requirements on what qualifies one to be a medical patient, and then therefore would allow one, in theory, to access cannabis products and to use them. If it was simply adult use laws, there would be a lot less hurdles or red tape to deal with, in theory. But as you point out, the physicians can be a big problem in this mix. And we're fortunate in California or in the United States. We've been with Project CBD to get to know some physicians who are really quite amazing, have done just cutting edge, phenomenal work with children who are extremely ill, and not just children, others, people doing pioneering work with cannabis oils, with different ratios of CBD to THC, with different terpene profiles. The terpenes are the components of the plant that give it its smell, and each of which do have medicinal properties. And all mixed together, it makes for something very special. But yeah, it's true. Just because one is a doctor or a scientist does not mean that one is shorn of cultural prejudices, or you don't carry cultural baggage along with you. And we've been taught since day one as a society that this is a bad thing, a bad plant associated with bad people, meaning darker skinned people. And that's it's difficult to let go of. But I think also from a physician's point of view, if they've not been trained in the whys and wherefores or the basics of medical cannabis, I can understand why a physician, just simply being a conscientious individual, would not be or would be somewhat reluctant to be giving advice or to be making recommendations about something that they don't really know much about. And that's an issue. So education is key. Obviously, there are doctors in Australia, some of whom who are really out front on this issue. I've met some of them when I visited in the past. But that takes some doing, some training. I think in the United States, what I see increasingly is medical professionals in increasing numbers are looking to learn more about cannabis and to see how they can integrate it into their practice. And we're talking about everyone from surgeons to massage therapists and everybody in between. A lot of holistic healers, so-called alternative medicine professionals, are very much interested in cannabis and CBD also, in particular. CBD is kind of like the rock star of the moment in the medical cannabis world. But again, I think that's the pendulum will, I think, swing back to a more sensible place and understand the medicinal value of THC and CBD is the combination really is what's what key and oftentimes for medical conditions. So yeah, it's going to be even if you had adult use in Australia, what I'm hearing is that medical patients would still be kind of left on their own to kind of figure things out in a way. And I think that to the extent that there are forums that patients can share their own experiences with each other, that's very, very important. That's happened in the United States and elsewhere. And I think it's been an important source of learning for patients themselves. And oftentimes it's the doctors who end up learning from the patients. The patient says they're doing this and this is what's been going on, or they get the test results and the doctors can't believe what happened here. Where did all the cancer markers go? It was going up, up, up. Now it just went down. What did you do? I said, well, I was taking the CBD oil, and the doctor would look, well, whatever you're doing, just keep doing it. I hear these stories over and over again. But it's not necessarily the doctor saying to do that. It's more that they're responding to what they're hearing. It takes time, but I think ultimately the plant will prevail here because it just makes too much sense.
Right. Yeah. And I do want to say, especially if there's anybody ends up listening to this, I've been guilty of having a bit of a dig at the medical establishment, but we have some amazing practitioners here. Like we've worked with Dr. John Tay in Brisbane, Jamie Record here, who are endocannabinoid practitioners doing an amazing job. So we do want to see the medical market grow and strengthen as well. But I feel like there's a space for both, as you said, to help each other, which is really...
The only thing I'll say about that's kind of ironic, but it's played out in different situations in the United States, particularly in the state of Washington. where the legalization for adult use ended up having a very negative impact on the medical cannabis community and the networks there. That they basically kind of got destroyed or overwhelmed when recreational was implemented. Doesn't have to be that way, but that's one of the many ironies of this story. That things like that tend to, you think, oh, well, just logical. The more legal it is, the easier it's going to be for a medical patient, or the better it will be. But that's not necessarily the case. It really does require community and education and interaction. There's that phrase of it takes a village to raise a child. I think in some ways it takes a village to heal a person. And cannabis can be a very important part of that, in that it's not just an amazing herbal medicine, but it's also a community building medicine. And that's been one of the very important aspects of cannabis as a medicine, particularly before it became legal, before it started to be accepted in state laws, that it really helped to engender a strong community. And we can look, as sometimes outsiders looking in, toward a community, think, oh, some of it's kind of silly, or, stoners and their movies and their film. But the fact of the matter is, that's an important part of what made cannabis popular, and also where some of the value is as a healing herb, is that it does instill a sense of community that's unusual. I was once at a panel with the woman named Kat Harrison, and she was she's known more for her work with psilocybin. She's an ethnobotanist, known for her work with psilocybin and so forth. But she was describing how, when she and the girls would get together, the other women in the community in California, they were all growing cannabis in their backyard. They wouldn't get together and talk about the different types of mint. Okay. Oh, you see, I have this mint. No, they were talking about the different strains and how that, and there's something very unique about cannabis in that way that I think it's underappreciated, and that's actually healthy and good, because we in the modern world, so to speak, even in the digital age with all our communication, we become more and more isolated, ironically. And so community is very important. And I think cannabis facilitates that.
I haven't thought about that side of it as much either, the benefits there. That's amazing. We're working with a political party here in Australia that's pushing for adult use, and what they want to bring in is a model similar to what they've done in Spain, where we can have a tightly regulated market with social clubs that act as not-for-profits, where people can come together. And I think that'd be potentially a really good way for us to go.
That would make sense. From what I observed when I was last in Barcelona, where there were a lot of clubs, very very well integrated into the city life. No big deal. There were clubs, people went to them, and that was that. I think no big deal should be almost like the working refrain, because people have made such a big deal about the plant on both sides of the discussion. It's just a plant. People should have access to it, and there should be safe places to go, and it shouldn't interfere with other people. That's that. So it does sound like it would be a good model in that way.
Yeah. Do you have time for 2 more questions? Is that okay?
Sure.
Thank you very much. The one thing that I really wanted to clear up, because our audience has a lot of confusion and questions around, there's 100 years worth of misinformation. And there's a lot of confusion around CBD, how it's produced, where it comes from, specifically from the fact that the regulations with the 0.3% THC lead people to believe that, above 0.3 is dangerous, below is safe, and it's just not the truth. It's more to do with the flowers. So I just wanted to know how you've tackled that with Project CBD, or how you try to explain where the CBD comes from, how it's grown, and the main question is the CBD companies that are acting in the United States now, how they're deriving the CBD and why it's a challenge for them to try and keep it under the 0.3%.
Well, it really is a clash of realities. There's the botanical reality, the actual realities of what the plant is. That's one thing. And then you have the legal reality, which is a surrealistic world, which is not really, it's not based on science, and it doesn't really correspond to the botanical realities. CBD comes from the flower top of cannabis. You can think of cannabis in a very broad sense in terms of two categories. There's hemp, and then there's drug plants. There's plants that are, and the crucial difference between hemp and drug plants, for lack of a better description, is not the amount of THC. It's not if it's 0.3% THC or less, meaning hemp, or more, meaning marijuana, as it's legally defined in the United States and elsewhere. That's not what makes the plants different. What makes hemp and the drug plants different is the amount of resin on the plant, the resin in the flower. You have low resin plants. That's what hemp has traditionally been. Hemp grown for fiber, hemp grown for the oil from the seed, which is very nutritious. Hemp grown for the hurd that you can make cement and fiberglass with. You know, it's an incredibly useful and variegated industrial plant, or a plant that has many different industrial applications. That's hemp. Low resin. High resin plants, the flower tops of high resin cannabis, that's what people refer to as marijuana. Colloquially, it's a word that some people aren't comfortable with because of the association with racism, but that's essentially what marijuana refers to. The resin in the flower tops of cannabis that's not being grown for fiber, but it's being grown for medicinal purposes or to smoke and get high or whatever. That's where the action is. The CBD comes from the flower top, from the resin. Wherever the resin is in the plant, the CBD will be in there, assuming that it's genetically a plant that's, you know, is a CBD rich plant. But that's where THC, CBD, that's where the action is, in the resin. And what's confusing about the law is that an arbitrary line has been placed across the plant saying, no, it's not about high or low resin, that's the way it used to be understood in the law. It's about the amount of THC. So it puts you in this weird position that if you want to get the most CBD from a cannabis plant, you have to then grow marijuana plants, high resin plants that will likely have more than 0.3% THC. That's where the problem is, that the plant, what we have in California, and what we've been growing for a while, the CBD comes from marijuana, not from hemp, because the amount of THC in the plant might be about 1% by dry weight, and maybe close to 20% CBD by dry weight. 1% THC, 20% CBD. You extract the oil from the plant, you'll get a lot of CBD. That's the best source of CBD. But with hemp plants that are typically grown for industrial purposes, usually have very, very little CBD and even less THC. Or some of the plants might have maybe 3% CBD and under the THC limits. They qualify legally as hemp, but that's not a really good source of CBD. You're getting much, much less CBD from there. And you have to grow a lot more plants then to get the CBD and so forth and so on. It just leads to all kinds of problems. So what happens is farmers or scientists are breeding hemp and cannabis together to try to get the amount of CBD up, but keep the THC down. And farmers end up growing plants that, if they grow to full term, will become hot, meaning they'll exceed the legal THC limit of 0.3% THC. In other words, let's say it takes 12 weeks to grow to full term, a particular hemp varietal. Well, what the farmers end up doing, they grow it for 6 weeks and then stop there, harvest it early, because it keeps the THC levels down, so it might make the legal cut. But it also keeps the CBD levels down. So you might maybe get 8% CBD rather than, or more. And so this game is being played constantly, and it's just stupid because the whole thing is defined wrong, and the law doesn't recognize the botanical reality. What is the difference if it's 1% THC or 0.3% THC? If you have a lot of CBD in the plant, it won't be intoxicating, or it would be very unlikely to be intoxicating. Part of it depends on the person who's using it. And so you get this kind of legal mess, and it's really stupid. So they passed a law in the United States legalizing hemp, defined as cannabis with 0.3% THC is less. And now all the hemp advocates who are pushing for that law are saying, oh, no, it doesn't work. And it's got to be 1% THC. Well, now they're stuck with the law that has boxed them in. It's what I refer to as, the phenomena of the women with the Chinese women with the small slippers or shoes that keep the feet bound. The idea that it should be privileged legally, only plants with this very, very minor amount of THC and not even slightly more, it's just stupid. And it's holding back the whole hemp industry in the United States. And I think all around the world, because traditionally hemp has not been grown for medicinal purposes in terms of what's coming from the resin. It's been grown for fiber and from oil from the seed, which again has many, many uses, but not so much medicinal uses in the way we think of it now. So it's a matter of, again, just treating the plant like what the plant is, rather than, carrying on a tradition of prohibition. Because what 0.3% THC really is all about is a way to keep marijuana illegal, saying anything under that is okay, anything over that is still, it's the evil weed. And it's just prohibition continuing in another form. You might say, from the point of view of the hemp industry, at least it's better now. In the United States, they can grow hemp, and it is. But still, it's held back the situation quite a bit, and it's made for a lot of confusion and a lot of harm for farmers who looked at growing hemp for CBD as a sort of a financial kind of a Hail Mary, that was going to get them out of dire straits financially. There's a lot of problem with farming in the United States, unless you're super big ag. And it ended up being oftentimes the first round with hemp growing for CBD, just a complete mess. Farmers lost a lot of money. They didn't really know how to grow this stuff well. The plants went hot. They kept being told, oh, you grow this, you're going to make so much money from CBD. It didn't really turn out that way. And part of it is because they're growing the wrong plants, or they don't understand what they're growing. If you want to grow something for medicine or for recreation, it has to be high resin cannabis. If you want to grow it for industrial purposes, that's low resin. And that's just the simple reality.
That's perfect. The botanical reality, which is the real reality, and then the political imposed reality, which is the false reality. And that's causing so much confusion, right?
A lot of tension there, because it's not a great fit. It's a partial fit, but it doesn't, it really, and it's just so silly. It really is so unnecessary.
Awesome. Let's leave it there. That was so perfect. I really, really, really appreciate you chatting to me there. Apart from the book, Smoke Signals and Project CBD, is there any other places that people can follow your work or?
Well, it's mainly projectcbd.org is the platform right now for the work that we're doing. But, we're not the only game in town. There's some other platforms that are really good. Healer.com is a really good one. Dr. Dustin Sulak is one of the pioneer medical cannabis physicians in the United States. He actually is in the East Coast in Maine, gives monthly seminars, and I believe they're free, where you can join, anyone can join that, and you'll learn a lot that way. He's very clear, even though the science can be kind of challenging in some ways. He makes it very accessible and very up to date. It's so that's healer.com is a platform that I would recommend. And then the book that we just have a new book that's coming out actually in a few weeks with Reader's Digest Press, but it's a book that focuses mainly on CBD, called The Essential Guide to CBD. And it is available online. I don't know what the situation is vis-a-vis Australia. It's just coming out in the US. And that's something that has it's a very clear explanation of the science, written for someone who likely has never even smoked a joint, just has nothing to do with the cannabis world, but also hopefully written in a way that even a doctor who is more immersed in the subject would get something out of it that would be useful. So in addition to Smoke Signals, there's a new book coming out. We're going to announce it actually next week on the web, on our platform. And we do have a newsletter, a weekly newsletter that's free, and that looks at various aspects, journalistically of the cannabis phenomenon, not just medical, but legal and cultural, and but mainly on the medical science. That's sort of the raison d'etre of what we're doing. But again, I've always felt that with cannabis in general and CBD in particular, the social dimensions of healing are really, really important here as well. It's not just what it can do for an individual, which is potentially quite significant, but what it can do for society as a whole in terms of moving in the directions we really need to move in.
Yeah. I'll track down that book when it comes out. We've also connected with Dr. Sulak as well. We've signed up to his healer course last year.
Oh, great. Yeah.
And so we always share the two main sources that we share with our audience is the Project CBD and the healer platform as well. So we'll send those links again to everybody who wants to access the healer course. But yeah, I think their monthly webinars are free as well. We watched the last two, Dr. Paula Stella, and there was a really interesting one on pets. I can't remember the doctor's name, but yeah, it's a fantastic resource.
Great.
Great. Thank you so much, Martin. I'll send you a follow-up email at some point, I'm sure. And enjoy your Friday or weekend. Friday?
This is Friday. What is it for you?
Saturday morning.
It's already Saturday morning. Well,
Yeah.
We're in Friday work afternoon. So very good. Well, nice talking to you.
Thanks to you. Thank you, Martin. Bye.
Take care.